Well, let's begin. Welcome, everybody. My name is Adam White. I'm director of the Center for the Study of the Administrative State at George Mason University's Antonin Scalia Law School, and it's my honor and pleasure to welcome you all today for a discussion of Congress and the administrative state, its powers, responsibilities, and possible reforms. I'll say a little bit more about the Center's work over lunch, but in the meantime, let's just get rolling with the discussion. This is the second conference that the Center has hosted on Capitol Hill, and I should say thank you very much to Senator Portman and his staff for allowing us the use of this room today. This is the second conference we've had on Capitol here. A year ago, we met to discuss proposals for legislation on regulatory reform, proposals like the Regulatory Accountability Act, the REINS Act, and other things. And those remain very important, but this year we thought we would change focus a little bit and instead focus on aspects of the relationship between Congress and the administrative state that sometimes gets a little less attention than it deserves. Specifically, the other powers that Congress has in addition to its legislative power to oversee to oversee the work of administrative agencies. Later today, we'll look at a couple of specific proposals for oversight mechanisms, specifically proposals for a congressional regulation office like the Congressional Budget Office, as well as a discussion of regulatory budgets. But we thought for our opening discussion this morning, we'd take a very wide-ranging look at Congress's powers, its constitutional duties, the ways in which Congress could exercise greater oversight or more effective oversight of the administrative agencies, and in some ways the constitutional basis for those mechanisms. A few years ago, there was a nice line in one of the Supreme Court opinions, Chief Justice Roberts' dissent in City of Arlington. He said, "An agency has literally no power to act unless and until Congress confers power upon it." It was a nice reminder that everything the agencies do ultimately begins or should begin with a grant of power from Congress. But of course, that's just the beginning of Congress's role, not the end of it. There's several other powers that Congress has vested in it by the Constitution that give it an ongoing role in the management of the administrative agencies. For example, James Madison famously said in Federalist 58 that Congress's power of the purse is the most effectual tool that the people have to protect themselves against the encroachments of the other branches of government. So the power of the purse is important. The appointments power, or at least the Senate's role in appointments, is also important, a point that Alexander Hamilton makes in Federalist 76, discussing the Senate's limited but very important role in the advice and consent to appointments. And so we'll touch on a few of those and other matters today, but without any further ado, let me introduce our speakers. Our first speaker this morning will be Ambassador C. Boyden Gray. Boyden is the founder of the law firm of Boyden Gray & Associates, where I had the pleasure of working for several years. Before returning to private practice, Boyden has served in government in a number of roles. Most recently, he was the United States Ambassador to the European Union and Special Envoy for Eurasian energy issues. Before that, he was President George H.W. Bush's White House counsel. And before that, he served in the Reagan administration with Vice President Bush, and especially in constructing and deploying the initial executive orders for the OIRA oversight process. When it's a pleasure to have you here today. We're also joined by Amanda Neely. Amanda is General Counsel to Senator Rob Portman, as well as Deputy Chief Counsel of the United States Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, chaired by Senator Portman. She handles Senator Portman's regulatory and infrastructure permitting legislative portfolios, including the aforementioned Regulatory Accountability Act. Before that, she served as Oversight Counsel on the U.S. House Committee on Ways and Means. She was an associate at the firm of Gibson Dunn, and she clerked for Judge David B. Santel. And our final speaker, I'm sorry, I guess Yuval, you'll go second, but our second speaker is Yuval Levin. Yuval is the Vice President of the Ethics and Public Policy Center in Washington, D.C. He edits National Affairs, which is the single best journal on public policy in the country today. I highly recommend it to anybody interested in public policy. Please do read it. And I'm not saying that just because you let me write in it every once in a while. Yuval, before that, served on the domestic policy staff of President George W. Bush and on the Bioethics Commission. So again, welcome to all three of you. Thank you so much for coming today. And we're hoping for just a wide-ranging discussion on Congress's powers and duties. We'll begin with Ambassador Gray, then Yuval, and Amanda. Boyden?
Well, thank you for putting me first. I know the reason for this is because I'm the only one old enough here to remember what it was like 50 years ago, 40 years ago. And the one point I would make is that the system we see today isn't what it was 40 years ago. And I'll go through some of that in a minute, but the decline of the role of the Congress in reining in the administrative state, for example, or for even monitoring certain aspects of foreign policy, like the war powers issue. It wasn't always that way, and it's not inevitable that it is the way it is today. So it can be fixed, should be fixed. I think in terms of domestic issues and the administrative state, the biggest problem is the overdelegation, which triggers the Chevron deference issues. That can be fixed, of course, by being more specific, but there's no question that the courts could help by not blindly accepting the inevitability of this growth in vagueness and ambiguity and sort of ducking. Justice Gorsuch made a very candid speech at the last Federalist Society conference, and he said people thought that the Commerce Clause was lost way back with Wickard versus Filburn, but it's been rolled back a little bit. And I don't know why we shouldn't take on the delegation issue as well. I mean, 1937 in Schechter was the last time it really was exercised, but there's no reason why we couldn't revive a little bit of that. I was so pleased to hear that. They are now looking at a case, they've taken cert on a case, criminal case, where several issues were raised in the cert petition, but the court granted cert limited to the one issue of non-delegation. So I hope all of you pay attention to this. It's been granted. It's obviously an indication of the revival of interest in the non-delegation doctrine beyond just encouraging the use of the canon as a canon of, using it as a canon of judicial construction. So I think we're going to see some green sprouts there. But again, pay attention to this, and those of you who have the wherewithal, I think amicus briefs and whatnot would be very helpful. So to get back to more practical, other practical things that can happen, and by the way, I really do think a quick swift in the butt by the Supreme Court on a couple of statutes would be very, very useful. I once had a brief conversation with the justice about that, and he nodded. This is before he made his very candid speech to the Federalist Society. And then I said, but there probably aren't going to be now for several years very many pieces of legislation. And he finished the sentence, coming out of Congress, you mean? And I said, that's right. And he said, well, there are a lot of good opportunities rolling around out there anyway. So he's on the lookout. A couple of ideas, practical for seeing things maybe happen a little quicker. I don't think Congress can do what it used to do with two-day work weeks. I just don't see it possible. Congress often worked 6.5 days. There were plenty of periods when they could go home, but the average work week was at least 5 days and sometimes 5.5. You cannot do rigorous markup sessions on a two-day work week schedule. When I first came here, the notion of passing a bill in order to find out what was in it was totally unheard of. The Pelosi statement would have been utterly shocking to anyone who was working here actively 40 years ago. By the time we got through markup sessions at both the subcommittee and the committee, full committee level, everybody knew every single word. And I think that's the way we've got to get back. I think the executive branch, again, if they're seeing legislation passed, could bring more attention by issuing statements of administration position that would have the president threatening a veto if a particular provision or set of provisions in pending legislation weren't tightened up. I think that one could see a requirement that says that lobbying by congressional offices, no offense, or staff on congressional offices, no offense, lobbying of the agencies for a particular provision or regulatory outcome should be made public. If a private sector person goes in and lobbies for that, that's logged at the agencies. It's logged at OMB if you go to OMB to do it. And why shouldn't a congressional office be required to disclose whose requests they are in a polite way laundering? And when you think about it a little bit, having Congress, and this may be an incentive to be vague, is because you can aggrandize the number of instances where you are lobbied to fix something that you should have fixed or not allowed to raise a question at the outset. It may be an incentive, but if it's made public, perhaps that incentive would drop away, and it would, to me, having these backdoor fixes reminds me of impermissible legislative, one-house legislative vetoes. And I don't know whether there's a case there or not, and a clear example, but you can't even think about a case if you don't know what the congressional offices are doing. I think that one could make some progress by ending the revolving door. I don't think that requires legislation. I think the executive branch could do it if it wanted to. But I do think that the current rules about personal and substantial involvement in a matter does disqualify you for life. I think that could be broadened and should be broadened. The legislative fixes that are pending, such as getting more cost-benefit analysis that applies to the agencies through Congress rather than just an executive order, which doesn't really apply in a sense of being judicially reviewable. I think that would be an enormous help. I'm encouraged by seeing the courts get into this, and Justice Scalia, not long before he died, hinted, well, it wasn't really a hint, it was a statement that a big mismatch between costs and benefits could be evidence of a rule being arbitrary and capricious. So the courts are beginning to apply it across the board, even if it's not in the statute specifically, or even if it's not covered by an executive branch executive order. One final sort of example, the REINS Act, which would require Congress to adopt the rule before any rule before it became a rule of law, I think is a very good solution to many of the problems. I don't see Congress adopting it anytime soon, but I want to emphasize that its parentage is very distinguished and long. It was something that was suggested years ago by Stewart and Justice Breyer, Richard Stewart and Justice Breyer. So it's not new, it's not radical, and it really would fix a lot of things. I would point out, and this is where I stop, that I work very closely, so you can discount what I say somewhat, but if you look at the 1990 amendments to the Clean Air Act, that is a REINS Act. I mean, you could have asked, today, to do something like that. The committees would delegate broad swaths of authority to do what was in the detail in the 1990 amendments, and then if you had the thing come back to Congress and adopt it, that would have been the same, roughly, as the level of detail in the original Clean Air Act. John Dingell wasn't about to delegate an ounce of discretion to EPA. He just wouldn't do it. And every time EPA tried to exercise a little undelegated discretion, they'd get a phenogram. So how many people are old enough here to remember what a phenogram is? I don't see any hands go up.
There's one back.
There are a couple.
Nosy remembers everything.
Jim Tosey probably originated the phenogram. A phenogram was named for David Finnegan, who was a longtime aide to Dingell, and it was the most terrifying thing that could happen to EPA was to have a 6-page, single-space phenogram float in, and Dingell wanted answers, and he got the answers. So this kind of discipline can be revived, should be revived. And the acid rain provision, which was a trading provision, which was supposed to be non-prescriptive, the original tonnage requirements were stated not utility by utility, but smokestack by smokestack within each utility. And the numbers were in the statutes, really quite astonishing. Go back and read the bill. It's not very long, but it's jammed with delicious detail. So it can be done, and a little kick in the butt from the courts might get it started again. Thanks.
Yuval?
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Adam, for getting us all together and for including me in this conversation. I think what I'll say builds right on where Boyden closed, in the sense that I want to talk a little bit about some of the obstacles to this kind of reawakening of assertiveness and ambition in Congress, and to think a little bit about why it has weakened in the way that it does. It has to be said, first of all, that Congress as an institution at this point is in bad shape by almost any measure, by public approval, by member satisfaction, in terms of legislative accomplishment, even just meeting its own procedural standards, committee action, floor action. On any of these criteria, you'd have to say that Congress is not in a great moment at this point. In one sense, it isn't doing much, but I think more importantly, what it does always feels broken as it's happening. And I want to take up two reasons for that are interrelated and that have to do ultimately with some of the causes of Congress's relative weakness in the constitutional system, that is relative to the other branches at this point. I would talk about member attitudes and incentives on the one hand, and about the budget process on the other hand, both of which I think are at the core of the problem, and they're connected to one another. I'd start with member attitudes because I think the fundamental problem is a matter of will and institutional ambition. Congress is weak because its members like it that way, whether they admit that to themselves or not. I think there's no getting around the fact that Congress could strengthen itself in the constitutional system. Executive and judicial overreach, which are serious problems, are made possible by legislative underreach, which I think is the most serious problem that is plaguing our system at this point. And that underreach is often explicit and intentional. Working in the Bush White House, I often found myself confronted with members of Congress who were asking us to do things that they could and should do themselves. And they weren't just unpopular things. They were often the kind of 80-20 issues that members are supposed to love, but getting the president to do it lets them take credit for it with their constituents, that they got the president to do it. But with those 20% who are unhappy, they can blame it on the administration, and they don't have to take responsibility for it. And you see it over and over. The members of Congress who see their role as getting the administration to do things they want. And so I think that there is this kind of, frankly, explicit dereliction of Congress's fundamental role. And it leads to vague legislation that leaves a lot of discretion for regulators and for judges, and then members can complain about how they use that discretion. We've seen that obviously in healthcare, we've seen it in banking and energy and a lot of other areas in the last few years. But I think there is a deeper incentive and attitude problem that's actually about how members of Congress now tend to think about the institution, and frankly has to do with how Americans in general think about institutions in our society at this point. I would say very broadly that we've gone from understanding our core institutions as formative or as molds that kind of shape the structure of our public life together, to thinking of them instead as performative, as platforms for people to perform on. And you can see that in a lot of major institutions. I think it has to do with what's going on in the universities. You can see it in a lot of the professions, but you definitely see it in politics. Obviously in the presidency at this point in some respects, but in some ways, most of all in Congress, where members of Congress understand their role as a part played in a broader political ecosystem in which Congress is not particularly central as a legislature, and the usefulness of Congress to them in that broader ecosystem is as a platform, as a way to raise their profile, as a way to get more attention, to get more time on cable news and on talk radio, so that the basic structure of their incentives, if they think about how do I become prominent, how do I become successful, how do I come to be appreciated, the answer is get attention. And that's not exactly an internal role. That's not a way of thinking about what to do inside Congress. That's thinking about what to do, in a sense, on top of Congress as a platform for yourself. And the problem that creates is that it leads members to think of themselves as outsiders, because in that larger political ecosystem, the most useful role you can play is the outsider criticizing the system. And so members come here and use the institution as a platform to get more attention as complainers about the institution. And you see it all the time. And again, I want to say this is not just happening in Congress. I mean, when the president tweets about something DOJ should have done in court, you want to say, well, you know, you could have had a phone call a couple of weeks ago and that would have happened. A lot of members of Congress are doing exactly the same thing. They can't wait to get off the floor of the House and the Senate so they can get in a TV studio and complain about the House and the Senate. And that's the structure of their incentives as political professionals leads them to think that way about the role of the institution, what it can do for them, and so in a sense what they should be doing for it and with it. And this obviously involves a profound confusion of incentives for them that makes it very hard for them to think fundamentally as legislators. I think that's happened in part, as I say, as part of a broader change in attitudes about institutions in our society. It's also, though, a result of the procedural dysfunction in Congress itself that means that members don't actually have a lot to do most of the time. The core of that problem, it seems to me, is rooted in the budget process. And so in closing, I want to say a few words about the budget process. As part of this transformation of incentives for members, budgeting obviously is near the core of what Congress does and should do. But I think that we've reached a point now where budgeting is really at the core of why Congress doesn't work. The 1974 budget process worked for a time, though I think you would have to say now that it worked for a pretty short time. It now interacts with a polarized politics and with members who are lacking in a certain kind of constitutional ambition in ways that really distort the work of the institution. The process means that the parties start out the legislative year with an abstraction to fight about, a budget resolution that is just a spreadsheet and a set of promises. Essentially, everybody understands that this isn't actually what Congress is going to do in the coming year, and that this is just about, again, setting up an argument, beginning a kind of performance for the public. The reconciliation process, which is supposed to be central to the budget process, is now completely disconnected from the budget process. It's a very important part of the legislative process, but it's not budgeting. It's used as a way to advance the most partisan and therefore the most difficult to advance through the Senate portions of the majority party's agenda. But those generally have very little to do with budgeting, and most of the energy is spent thinking about how to push things through the Byrd rule and get around the fact that reconciliation is supposed to be about budgeting. And ultimately, for most members who are not in leadership, who are not chairmen of committees, what that means is that they exercise the power of the purse once a year in an up or down vote on a piece of legislation that they did not produce. They're functioning more like the executive in our system. They're given a kind of veto, an up or down veto, and they're not functioning as legislators. And most of the time, they don't have anything to do that you would call legislating. And I think that also contributes to why they spend so much of their time doing other things and don't understand themselves and their ambition as shaped through the institution, as channeled through Congress. and so is fundamentally legislative ambition. I think this has an enormous amount to do with why Congress is underperforming relative to the other branches, and an enormous amount to do with why it doesn't function well in oversight, with why it doesn't exert its power over the executive branch, and to an extent the judicial branch. Addressing that would require some structural reforms. It would require, above all, though, a change of attitude that is not going to be easy to advance. But I do think that changing the structure of the institution can help change the incentives. And to my mind, that begins especially with budget process reforms.
Thanks, Yuval. Yeah, as you were mentioning, members of Congress racing to tape interviews on cable news, it occurred to me we're standing just 200 feet away from the rotunda where they like to tape the interviews so often. On the point you raised about individual members of Congress's incentives, I do want to highly recommend an article that this center's founder, Professor Naomi Rao, wrote a couple of years ago for one of the center's programs. Professor Rao is now the OIRA administrator at the White House, but before that, she wrote, I think, now the definitive article on Congress's incentives and how that pertains to administration. So I highly recommend it. Amanda?
Thanks, Adam. Yuval, I'm really feeling good about my life choices right now. Thank you for all of that. Well, that's what I'm about to talk about. And before I get started, I'm obligated to mention that the views I express here today are my own and do not necessarily reflect those of Senator Portman, the Senate, or Congress, or the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations. I want to thank George Mason's University Center for the Study of the Administrative State for hosting us today. And I really want to thank Adam for hosting this panel and for incisive questioning today. Go easy on us. I was amused when I saw the agenda for today's talk. I noted that the title of our panel is The First Branch, ? Oversight, Appropriations, and Legislation. So are we the first branch? And I think that you will note, when you came in here today, I think you got a handout that noted that the Wi-Fi password is Article 1, all lowercase, one word, you're welcome. Perhaps a not so subtle reminder of where we are and what we are about and where we fall in the Constitution. And in its role as the first branch of government, Congress has the authority and responsibility to oversee the executive branch, including the administrative agencies. And I will agree with my co-panelists here that we could do it better. And there are a number of reasons for that, but I also think that it's important to talk about some of the ways we do it well. But just to pick up on a couple of their points, and then I'll turn to a few of my own, I think that both Boyden and Yuval hit on a really key thread about Congress's abdication of some of its responsibility. And that is, in particular, staffing. And again, these are my views, not those of Senator Portman or anybody else. And I think that a number of the problems that they identified could be solved by better staffing, which also means better funding for congressional staff. Boyden mentioned the overdelegation to the agencies and the lack of specificity in legislation. Part of that comes because we don't necessarily always have the staff capacity to develop really comprehensive legislation. Congressional staff are notoriously paid very little, and we are public servants. And I'm not complaining about my own salary, but just generally, coming to Washington, D.C. and being told to live on $20,000 a year is a tough sell for a lot of people. And it also prices out a lot of people who might otherwise want to serve in public service. And it also prevents a lot of people from staying in public service. Or they actually look at their options and say, you know what, I can make more money working for an administrative agency, I'm going to go over there. The CFPB, in fact, is not subject to the GS schedule. It's under the Federal Reserve schedule, so that there they can make up to like $250,000 a year. Probably not the $20,000 staff assistant, but You can do a lot better in a lot of the administrative agencies. So it's hard for Congress to recruit and retain great staff. And to Yuval's point, if the CEO of a company went out and said, I work for a swamp. I work in the most miserable institution in the whole world. I want to reform it, but I can't do it. Hey, come and work for me here. It doesn't sell. If you've got members of Congress who don't believe in this institution's mission and our ability to create change, it's really hard to recruit idealistic, smart, hardworking young people who want to come in and advocate for that change and work within the institution and be good faith participants in it, and not just standing on top of Congress as self-serving individuals complaining about the swamp. And to that point, it actually might be helpful if this whole place was run by interns, because they are the ones who come, and it kind of is, but they are the ones who come in every day and talk about their idealism and their hope. And by the time you get to be a more senior staffer, sometimes it's harder when you hear your bosses come in every day and talk about the swamp. That said, I work for a boss who, I will brag on my boss a little bit, that he is a guy who is committed to working within the system and trying to work across the aisle. Every time I get an assignment to go introduce a piece of legislation, or I suggest to him that we introduce a piece of legislation, his very first question is, who's my Democrat co-sponsor? Go find that person. And I think we need a lot more of that. And at the same time, that question is a really hard question. When your boss says, go find me a Democrat co-sponsor, that can take months and months of negotiation. And again, to that point of we need staffers who are expert enough and paid well enough to come here and commit to that process. I think all of those things would help with the overdelegation problem, the need to be more specific, the revolving door problem that Boyden mentioned, the vague legislation, and the feeling broken as it's happening. I think I've hit on a number of your points now. So I think I've talked a little bit here about what we can do to fix the problems, but what are we doing well right now already? And I work in oversight. And when I say oversight, a lot of people think big congressional hearings. They think Goldman Sachs during the 2008-2009 financial crisis being perp walked up to my subcommittee now. Or they think Apple, Tim Cook coming up here and testifying. That is a part of oversight. Hearings are important, but they are the culmination of a lot of other oversight work. And there's a lot of other oversight work that takes place behind the scenes that most people never hear about. And actually, I thought that was a really interesting point, because my first point about what do we do as congressional overseers, we do a lot of calls and we do a lot of meetings with the agencies. And Boyden made a really interesting point that I hadn't thought about before of congressional staff and member lobbying. Should all of those calls and meetings be disclosed publicly? I've never really thought about my congressional oversight responsibilities as lobbying, and maybe you could draw a distinction between what would be lobbying versus what is our constitutional duty to conduct oversight. But a lot of our oversight does happen when you pick up the phone and say, I don't think this regulation is working like it should be. I think, agency, you are doing something that Congress didn't intend. How are you going about fixing this? And sometimes just picking up that phone and letting agencies know that Congress is watching is a really effective way to get them to change their behavior. The next step up, we do a lot of document requests. We do a lot of subpoenas. We do witness interviews. We do depositions. And to a large extent, up until kind of recently, I don't think people were paying attention to that. I think with the Senate Judiciary and the House and Senate Intel investigations more recently, it's become apparent that we actually do these document requests and witness interviews and depositions. And a lot of those have leaked to the press lately. So those have become a little bit more public. One element of oversight that I think nobody really knows about and members don't use enough, site visits, showing up at an agency and starting to ask questions, showing up at one of their field offices and talking to the line employees. Full disclosure, I am going to an agency right after this to go talk with employees and get some demos. And sometimes the line level employees are actually really encouraged to see that Congress is there and we care. And sometimes the leadership gets a little terrified that we're walking through their office space and handing out business cards, but it's effective. And I think we've touched on the appropriations process. The nominations process, we can hold up nominations. That's the most obvious way of conducting oversight there. But also, when someone is nominated, those nominees walk through Congress. They meet with all the senators. And during those meetings, senators extract promises. And sometimes they do that publicly at hearings as well. My boss somewhat recently had an agency or a potential agency head before him. And he said, look, your agency has not been producing the documents that we requested. What are you going to do about that? And that nominee said, you know what, I commit to working with you and to making sure that we get you the documents you've requested. We are still working on that, but we now have a good relationship with that agency head, and they're taking the oversight seriously. So that's really helpful. And then one other point that we haven't really touched on is Congress has set up bodies that are dedicated toward oversight. And I think you guys will be talking a little bit later about the idea of having a body dedicated toward the examination of regulations, which I think is probably, I haven't thought through it really carefully, but probably a good idea. But we already have the Government Accountability Office, and most agencies have inspector generals that Congress has authorized to go in and do oversight. And we rely really heavily on those folks and are very appreciative of their dedication, their work, and their expertise. And they sometimes do a better job of keeping people around a little bit longer than we do. So I think I'll stop. Oh, one other point I will make. Effective oversight. What makes for effective oversight? And one of the things that we have lost, I think, in a lot of our oversight is the ability to be bipartisan. And some of the most effective oversight I have seen, it really requires people from both sides of the aisle to get together and agree that we see a problem and we want to fix it. And if you have both members, or both the ranking member and the chairman, coming together to go forward on an oversight mission, you can really get a lot more done, in part because the agency realizes and the career officials realize that come November, this request is still going to be out there. We're still going to pursue this. It will not be a short-term interest. So I'll just put a plug in for bipartisan oversight. And with that, I'll turn it back to Adam for right now.
Great. Thank you very much, everybody. Before we go to audience questions, I'll just ask a few questions of my own. And actually I want to pick up on some of Amanda's comments first, actually. It seems to me from the outside that, speaking very generally, Congress operates on multiple tracks at the same time. They're legislating over here, they're appropriating here, they're overseeing here. I mean, in the oversight process that you've experienced, both at its best or at its worst, do you think your job would be made more effective or more complicated if it were somehow tied to the appropriations process? Say, if you actually had, if the people in Congress, the committees doing, or the subcommittees doing oversight, actually had more of a role in writing the checks to the agencies, would that be an improvement, or would that just complicate things?
I think that's a great idea, actually. It's frustrating as an overseer sometimes to see a problem and recognize that there might be an appropriations solution, and you pick up the phone and you call the Appropriations Committee, or your boss sends a letter over there, and you don't see the line items reflecting what the problems that you're seeing in oversight. That said, we're not doing as much in the way of appropriations, so ultimately, right now, would that be very effective? I don't know, but if the process really was working the way it should, I think having more of an oversight voice in the appropriations community is a great idea, and one I will take back to my boss.
Okay, well, I'm glad I asked. Yuval Boyden, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, the thing I was thinking about, one should have mentioned earlier, but is the question of appropriations riders, which in a sense do depend on a workable budget process with 13 separate bills. It's pretty hard to do riders and continuing resolutions. It's they'll be ignored because you have to sign the continuing resolution, but you don't have to sign an individual. I mean, the damage in terms of government shutdown is not a big issue. But I remember, because I'm only one old enough to remember this, NHTSA issued a rule years ago to encourage or mandate seatbelt use. It was called the ignition interlock rule. I know Tozy can remember it, but I don't. And that required you to belt up before you could start the car. And they had a demonstration down here on Capitol Hill. And the problem with it was you had to get in the car in the exact formation as had been anticipated by the engineers in Detroit. And the congressman couldn't get in the car the right way and in the right order and sit in the right seats. And so the car would never start. And it took less than a month before a rider went through to zero out the money for any further pursuit of the ignition interlock system. Other appropriations riders have been issued of far greater importance, but you don't see much of that anymore. And I don't want to take the time to get into this. This is sort of my current obsession. You have this, it's been in the news a lot about corporate average fuel economy, global warming, should the Obama rules be relaxed? And the agency that appears to be in the driver's seat negotiating with the state of California over whether their waiver is right or wrong, should we take the waiver back, which gives them a separate authority to set their own standards, and a third of the country would go with them. Then you'd have two separate cars. It's like dividing the car industry in two. That's all, to me, kind of nonsense. The reality is that the DOT statute, EPCA, has a flat-out preemption. There isn't any discretionary waiver. It's a flat-out preemption. California can't do this. And in the old days, there would have been an appropriations rider that says to EPA, defer, stand down, the provision that applies is in EPCA. Now, that's what would have happened 40 years ago. Today, I mean, people are running for the hills when this issue comes up on Capitol Hill.
Boy, not this image of all the members of Congress sitting in the wrong seats and sort of stopping the car from running. I thought you were spinning a metaphor for Congress today.
Well, it was maybe a forerunner. Yes, it could have been.
Thank you all.
Well, I do think there's a distinction between oversight and appropriation. They need to be related in the sense that ultimately there have to be appropriations consequences for some of what's turned up in oversight. But I do think the work is distinct and shouldn't be confused for one another. I actually think the distinction we have now between authorization and appropriation is more worth questioning, especially in a Congress without earmarks. The idea of having distinct committees for authorization and appropriation in the same arena, it seems to me combining that could help Congress do some of its budgeting work more effectively. But just combining everything probably isn't the way ultimately to help Congress function more effectively. I would certainly love to see the reemergence of appropriations riders. I mean, that was, even when I was working on the Hill, which was not 40 years ago, but I guess 20 years ago, at the Budget Committee and working for the Speaker, the degree to which Congress exercised its power through appropriations riders was enormous. And that happens much less. It's not that it doesn't happen at all, but those riders now are riders on a vastly larger bill, kind of omnibus riders, and there are far fewer of them, and so they're much less engaged in the details of the sort of tussle of oversight. So I think a budget process that had a little more room for that would be welcome.
Great. Now, Boyden, you kicked off the conversation by describing some of the ways in which the process has changed, or the relationship between Congress and the agencies has changed in your time in Washington. Do you have any thoughts on why that change happened?
Well, I'm afraid I think that it's maybe really practical. In the old days, you couldn't go home you didn't have the money to go home for the weekend. Part of it was the pre-airline deregulation, which dramatically reduced the cost of travel, but part of it was Congress didn't provide the money. And then along about 20, 25 years ago, they provided the money for weekend trips, and this place empties out. And you've lost the community that necessarily developed when you would find yourself with a member of the opposite party in a parent-teacher conference situation, you know, at a school function, soccer games, lacrosse games, whatever. You could even have dinners. I remember great dinners in the old days. Today you can't do it because they're only here 2 days, basically, 2.5 days. And at night they have to vote, so you can never count on a congressman or a senator to go have dinner. And without a congressman and senator to throw food at, the dinner isn't any fun anymore. So that has been a big change. People just don't know each other. They're not here. And I think that's, I get tugged both ways. I sometimes think the best thing that could happen would be to eliminate air conditioning altogether. And then that would empty the place, you know, beginning in May, and nobody would come back until October, and that might be really good. But if you're going to be here and be a Congress, I think you got to be here 5 days a week doing the things that you're supposed to do, which is work on legislation and work on the language, pay attention to what's going on in foreign policy, authorize the wars that are taking place there. That's part of the constitutional structure and demand, and it's just not happening. And again, I come back to the 2-day work week. You can't do it in 2 days.
Yuval, Amanda, either of you got any thoughts on that? Well, just one last question before we open up the mics for the audience. Yuval, you talked about Congress not having ambition, sort of in the sense that James Madison wrote about in Federalist 51. And again, I guess I have a how question. You know, how do we make members of Congress ambitious as members of Congress, right? What's the external force from the voters? Do the voters even really want members of Congress to be ambitious as members of Congress?
Yeah, no, I think that's the question. I think there's a lack of constitutional ambition in general. I mean, I would say the same about the executive branch. Not that presidents lack ambition, but that they lack what I would describe as executive ambition in our constitutional system. And a lot of their ambition now is also performative, and by no means only this president, but as a general matter, they sort of see their role, and judges too, see their role as putting on a show. And that confuses a lot of how the incentives are supposed to work in our system. You know, it seems to me that some of the things that Boyden talks about would make a big difference on this front. If members understood themselves more as belonging to this institution, invested some more of their pride in the institution and how it functions, I do think that it would make some difference on this front. But it also seems to me that the structure of their work, and again, what's required is a set of institutional reforms that means that more of what they do is legislation, is the actual work of legislating, so that rather than consolidate everything, I would break up the budget process into smaller parts that are done all the time, so that Congress spends most of its time working on legislation and on oversight. If you just look at the schedule of a member of Congress now, part of the problem is they're not here much of the week when they're in session. And part of the problem is when they are here, not much of their time is taken up by what I think would traditionally be recognized as legislative work. That can be changed. Congress does have the power to change its own operations, its own structure, its own organization. It's happened before. I think there's some encouraging signs on this front. The massive budget bill they just passed, among other things, created a new select committee, a joint select committee on budget reform, which, you know, won't have immediate effect, I suspect, but these kinds of things actually can be pretty important in just starting a conversation that begins from the premise that we can change the institution to make it work the way we want it to.
Well, thanks. Well, we have about 25 minutes left for audience questions. There's two roving microphones in the room, so please, if you have a question, raise your hand and somebody will find you. Just a couple of points. One, please identify yourself before asking the question. And please, like the game show Jeopardy, please phrase your statement in the form of a question. Do we have any questions? There's one over here.
David Wagner, formerly of Regent Law School and an alumnus of George Mason Law School, and also an alumnus of House Subcommittee. And back when I was on the staffer on that subcommittee 20 years ago, what we saw was the appropriations process beginning to devour the authorizing process. You know, our authorization, we worked hard to get an authorization bill through Congress, but it was the Clinton era. There was lots of veto bait in it. We knew it wouldn't become law. So if it became to become law, we had to amend the appropriations bills. The appropriators hated us, but that was the only game in town. My question is, well, does that description sound right to those who were here then? But also, is the recent system of omnibus spending bills devouring the appropriations process?
Anybody? Yuval?
Well, that certainly sounds right to me. I mean, I worked in Congress in the late 90s in a very junior capacity. I was just out of college, but I worked for the House Budget Committee and then for the Speaker. And I would say there was a strange moment in the late 90s when it was possible to have bipartisan compromises on the budget, but almost in no other arena, so that an enormous amount of what should have been authorizing work was done in the budget process. And some of those were successful. I mean, I think the 97 budget process is an example of Congress working even in spite of procedural and structural problems. But it did mean that policy was advanced by appropriation and not by authorization. To me, that's one reason to think about knocking down the wall between authorization and appropriation, again, especially now in a Congress that doesn't have earmarks, at least for the time being.
I agree largely with what you've said. I even just in the last few weeks with the omnibus bill, and talking about passing legislation to know what's in it, I think the House omnibus came over to the Senate just the same day or the day before it was going to be passed. And it obviously was going to be passed, and staffers are scouring it frantically to figure out, how was my thing funded? Was it funded? Where is it? What's it called? And putting together a memo for your boss saying, here are your priorities that were funded, here's what wasn't done. We're obviously going to fund the government. We don't want to shut it down, and we need to vote for this bill. It doesn't give a lot of time to thoughtful consideration about funding of priorities. And I think that significant reform there would be helpful, and I agree that connecting the authorization and appropriations process would be a useful step.
Do you have anything to add?
Well, it seems I agree that, the continuing resolution, the mega bill has swallowed up both processes, and that's not good. As you all said, it really has got to be broken down in smaller pieces to get more attention to the detail of each, and that's gone. Part of the reason for this may very well be the work that Gingrich did in the 90s to pull so much of the power into the Speaker's office, which is where much of it still resides, and stripping the committees of their authority and their responsibility. And I think that's got to get reversed. It's got to go back to what they call regular order, I guess. And that's part of what I was talking about, the way things were done in the old days. Today, a lot of it's done behind closed doors in the Speaker's office or the leader's office. And that's not, I think, a really productive way to proceed.
Yuval, were you going to add something?
Yeah, I very much agree with that, but I would just add one other factor that it's been nicely pointed out in the last few years by Francis Lee, the great political scientist at the University of Maryland, that one other way in which Congress is different now is that it always seems like control could change hands in the next election. And that means that it's never really in the minority party's interest to cooperate, even in ways that might advance its priorities, because the idea is always, we'll take control next time and then we'll really get this done. And what we need to take control is for them to fail, and therefore what we need is a lot of show votes that put them in a bad position, and ultimately we don't want this process to get anywhere. I don't think members of Congress are quite that cynical about the work they're doing, but there is a fair amount of that, and it combines with the centralization and leadership, which I completely agree with Boyd, really transformed a lot of the way these processes work. To my mind, the committee system is where the heart of Congress ought to be, is where the work really ought to be done. And that was changed explicitly and consciously and on purpose by Gingrich with reasons. The reasons were not crazy, but I think ultimately the effects have harmed the Congress.
Well, I've been jotting down a list as we go. It seems so far the reforms we need are a bigger congressional budget, more riders, more complicated legislation, more powerful committees, and an all-powerful John Dingell. It feels like, and I think you put it well at the end, Yuval, that a lot of this reflects the costs of reforms. You know, the reforms of the 90s had benefits, but we're now seeing
absolutely. I'd say the same about the budget process. The 74 budget process is as it is for a reason, but we're paying the price for some of the other sides of the coin.
Is the filibuster one of those things? Not to put everybody on the spot, but it just occurred to me. Filibuster reform, one of those things?
I have a view on the filibuster that I think is increasingly a minority view, but I actually would be more inclined to have the House have a filibuster than to take away the Senate's filibuster. I think ultimately the Congress exists to compel accommodation in a diverse country, and not to enable temporary majorities to have their way. And so there's a downside to this, and I think the arguments for getting rid of the filibuster are very serious arguments. They come close to being persuasive to me, but ultimately I think the work of the Congress has to be, so much of the frustration now is a mismatch between the House and Senate. And the question is, should the House be more like the Senate or the Senate more like the House? And I'm just of the former view at the end of the day.
I was actually having just this conversation with Chris DeMuth right before we got started here, so maybe you would like Chris to take the opposing view. Yeah. But I generally am of the feeling that we should retain the filibuster. I say that begrudgingly because it is very, very hard to get anything done right now. And I will say that you might even be giving Congress too much credit right now in terms of, I think that the opposing party generally does not want to get anything done right now, including things that are in their interest, because giving Republicans wins right now is that's less in their interest than accomplishing some of their policy goals. And I say that with the current party breakdown, but it would be the same way, I think, if the Republicans were in the minority. So I don't think that's unique to the Democrats. But I think that our system was designed to be slow, and there are supposed to be checks and balances, and if we did not have the filibuster in the Senate, there would be very little check on a one-party held Congress from flying forward with a lot of ill-conceived ideas. And I will say that having to go back and forth in that negotiation process to get a Democrat co-sponsor and to get it to the floor leads to a lot of really thoughtful ideas. I don't think either party has a monopoly on the good ideas. So I've been very grateful for the input of my Dem colleagues. I say that with one of my negotiating partners here in the room. So, but very, very grateful for their input. So I will support the filibuster for now.
I do worry a little bit myself about the filibuster, in that it creates a policy vacuum at the national level, and nature abhors a vacuum, and who fills that vacuum? Well, it's the agencies over and over again. But Boyden, you might have better thoughts on this.
Well, again, I'm old enough to remember the, Strom Thurmond reading the phone book and Cots being brought in. And that was, to me, the filibuster, Now all you have to do is raise your hand, I filibuster, and then you go back to your ordinary life. And no one ever suffers anything in Congress for having to conduct a filibuster. All you got to do is raise your hand once. And so that's not right. It just doesn't seem right. It's too easy to filibuster. Filibuster was meant to exact pain from both the people doing it and the people receiving it. And that's totally disappeared. Filibusters are just, it's just like going to the bathroom. You can just...
Do we have any other audience questions? There's one here in the middle. There's a microphone coming to you.
I'm Brian Hawkins. Ambassador Gray, you mentioned a Supreme Court case that was dealing with the non-delegation doctrine. What was the name of that case?
Let me consult my little...
Oh, there it is.
It's Grimley, is that right? Versus the United States. So I think my reading is terrible.
I think our friend Adam Gustafson may have already found the answer. Bring the microphone to Adam if you don't mind. Gundy versus United States?
Gundy, yeah.
Okay. Thanks. Any other audience questions? Oh, thank you. Right here on the side.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, I'm James Goodwin with the Center for Progressive Reform. I thought it was interesting you brought up appropriations riders, because that's something that I've seen as actually reinforcing a lot of dysfunction in Congress, because it's been deployed as a partisan tool. In some ways, it discourages regular order legislation. So to hear it cited as its expansion as a way of getting things back in shape in Congress struck me as strange. Could you talk a little bit more about that and where I might be wrong in my concerns about the appropriations riders?
Yuval?
So I think of this question in the same context as the idea of combining authorization and appropriation. There's certainly a way that appropriations riders can be a form of dysfunction. I mean, I think they often are. That is a failure of authorization that is addressed in the course of the appropriations process. But I think at some level, Congress has to learn from the way its own work ends up happening about how it should restructure itself, so that if this is the only way that members are able to advance policy priorities, then they should think about changing the structure of the institution to allow them to advance their policy priorities. And so I don't think of appropriations riders in the current system as a permanent solution to some of the problems Congress has, but I do think that it is a way that has allowed, in the face of failures in the last 25 years, that has nonetheless allowed Congress to legislate, but also especially to assert itself against the executive in ways that have been meaningful. Obviously, there are plenty of examples of places where that has not worked in a way that we would describe as constructive. I think both parties can point to those. But if part of the problem we're facing is that Congress is proving unable or maybe unwilling to assert itself, I think we should look at the exceptions to that and think about how the rest of the process might be reorganized so that those are not exceptions, but are appropriate and legitimate ways for Congress to exercise its power.
I'll ask one last question in closing. Boyd, you talked about, and we just mentioned this case, Gundy. The Supreme Court famously was reluctant to enforce the non-delegation doctrine, to strike down legislation, not so much to interpret legislation, but to strike it down. And Justice Scalia was one of the leading defenders of that approach in the Whitman case. But now, we find ourselves in a cul-de-sac of sorts, where Congress itself, it seems, isn't fixing the problem. So maybe it's time for greater judicial involvement. But Scalia had good reasons for sort of backing away from that. How do you see this in terms of the role of the courts in nudging, to borrow a word, in nudging Congress towards a more functional approach?
Well, a couple of, it's a little bit complicated answer. I think that Scalia was changing his mind at the end of his life, and he was beginning to agree with the work that Thomas was doing. And so I think had he lived, he would have gone almost 180 degrees from his original thoughts. The second part of this is he when he first encountered the question, he didn't think Chevron was all that meaningful because he wasn't as quick to find ambiguity in a statute as authorizing unlimited discretion. He never got past step one. You know, there's no ambiguity here. The statute means this, and so for him, non-delegation wasn't a problem. But much later, or more recently, the vagueness got greater and greater. The gaps got greater and greater. The breadth of discretion got greater and greater. And I think Scalia was being to respond to that. He couldn't say as frequently, no, it's clear, because it was more and more not clear. And as that developed, so did his own evolution and his own thinking.
Well, on that note, why don't we bring this panel to a close a few minutes early? We'll reconvene instead of at 10:55, we'll reconvene with the next panel at 10:45 and get an early jump on it. But please join me all in thanking our three speakers.